to avoid taxes, but apparently I have a big problem with not having enough expenses that's causing a problem.
Oh yeah, I do that. I did that this year. That's why my bill is $30,000 this year.
Apparently I have a big problem with not having enough expenses that's causing a problem.
And Ted declared his problems to the world, so we're all set.
I think everybody knows how much you're paying in tax.
Many problems. Yeah, I'm sure everybody feels tax season though.
Because my tax year for the high voltage ends in June, it messes everything up for me. And then they have this thing where like they kind of like guess what the tax is in June, and then you don't really figure it out until like October, and then maybe you start paying it, and like the next they had the weirdest delayed system. It's like that doesn't really help me. So like I get to do like this is what I think, and then we get to go back and check.
Yeah, those estimation systems typically leave you scrambling.
Yeah, well, what happens is like for some reason I estimated low again.
Well, I mean, what else are you going to estimate?
It's definitely one of those things like when you have a high number and a low number, we're going.
Well, you pay more with the high number, so you're always going to estimate low.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody who would estimate high.
Or the IRS's willingness to give the money back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of SEO Fight Club. Today we have a topic that came up in the IMG community. A tester over there, Joe Priest, created a poll about this debate, which is better, Seattle lawyer or lawyer Seattle. And I had one thought on the matter, and then Kyle chimes in with a completely different understanding of the matter. And I'm like, holy crap, this is still an issue, and I haven't looked into it in a long, long time. And it's like, we should come around and look at this again. So what do you think of the topic today, Kyle?
Well, I like that it comes from the group. I think that's what the group is for. The idea of asking a question, and then we can have a discussion on it, and then kind of create a show out of it. I think that's what the community is supposed to do.
Yep. So this, this really isn't about coming to a definitive conclusion, but let's just kind of look at it, and see what we see. But before that, let's do some boilerplate. So, Clint, what can we expect from SEO this week?
So we go over and look at a couple of cool tools to help you out. And then we have a pretty lengthy discussion about the latest update and our opinions on what it was and how they're applying it, and then the processes of releasing those updates now that Google seems to be following.
Yeah, and I believe you mentioned that you were changing your format. Is that a permanent change or just some of the time?
Yeah, it's going to be a permanent change. What we're going to do is the top 3 stories, instead of finding a whole bunch of them, just give you the top 3. And then do some question and answer section, and then do a site audit and kind of carry that over. So I think that will provide a little bit more insight and instead of just looking at the news. So.
Okay. And if somebody in the audience wants to participate in your site audit, how can they get involved?
Reach me on Skype, or if you're at SIA, you can reach me there, or in IMG, you can reach me there. I already have the next week's site. Someone already reached out, so we're good for next week. But you can send them and we'll line them up.
And are you still considering the idea of getting a helper or co-host, or is that something that you've put to rest?
No, I'm still wanting to do it. Just kind of figuring out, where am I going to find the person? Mainly like which community to reach out to. More than likely, it'll probably be from someone from the SIA, and then we'll carry that over, and maybe another one from IMG, and we'll see how that works out. And that whole intern process that you talked about. I don't want to sound too gaudy and be like, I have an intern. So we'll see how that rolls.
All right. And so if people are interested, should they reach out to you, or do they just have to hope you discover them?
You can reach out to me if you want. Don't be surprised though if I don't answer right now. So, but you can reach out to me on Skype or in Slack if we're connected on Slack there as well.
Excellent. And I highly recommend you check out SEO This Week. It's an amazing show. It's a great resource. It can be a huge time saver too, especially if you spend a lot of time pouring through the various publications out there. So with that, the IMG test tool, if you're a tester out in the world and you're doing SEO testing specifically, you may want to see what this is all about. Again, I know I'm speaking to 12 people on the planet, but I'm hoping to find those 12 people and bring them all together. So if SEO scientific testing is your cup of tea, come take a look at this and let's maybe talk about it. So, to our topic, I think that there's a natural language processing problem that Google faces with whether or not Seattle Lawyer and Lawyer Seattle are the same thing to Google. And I know a lot of people say, well, it's practically the same thing to me for all practical purposes. But I think the underlying fundamental question is, what does Google do with them? And so I'm kind of looking at this problem, trying to see it through Google's eyes. And so, for example, we have an inverted keyword here, green frog and frog green, where the first one, the entity is an animal, the identifier known as frog, the condition that is green, a green frog. And when you swap those words, the potential definition of what the thing is can change. So as frog green, it's a color known as green that is like a frog. That's a different search intent potentially. And I know not all keywords have that, but Google has to allow for it because that inversion could have a totally different definition. And so I think that's a complicated factor where Google probably has to throw a lot of AI at sorting out those problems. Any thoughts on that so far?
Well, with Google giving us the NLP API, that they are at least thinking about entities.
Yep.
So this is, if it's in use or not, it's definitely on their radar.
Yeah. So this is kind of like the problem, and Google may or may not solve it well. But this is what they're contending with when people type things into search. And so these inversions, they can go beyond 2 words. So you can go to 3 words, 4 words, 5 words. And the question becomes, are all inversions the same? Is it only 2-word inversions? Is it only, location plus occupation entities? So you start getting into this area where you have to define what is the thing that Google is treating the same. So when we say that they're the same, is it, all 2-word inversions, or is it specific entity types being inverted? And so there's a definition problem to the problem, if that makes sense. And I think the belief is that entity pairs like place plus occupation and occupation plus place are canonicalized to the same search results for cache efficiency on Google servers. And if this is true, then getting the same cached result set would be easy to check for, and it would validate the theory just like instantly. And even if it wasn't 100% of the time, if it was just some of the time, that would be good enough to say that Google some of the time is canonicalizing the inversion. And so I figured that would be a good thing to look for. And so when I first looked, I wanted to see, are the variations the same? And for this example, they are. For all examples, they tend to be the same. And there's an implication with this in that tools like Pop and Cora and other tools that use variant keywords will often give the same advice for both of the inversions because they're measuring the exact same list of things. And so that gives a perspective that Google treats them the same because the advice the tools gives are the same for each. But it's not necessarily true. It's kind of an illusion caused by the tools being a layer of obfuscation. So when we look at what's happening in Google, instead of what's happening in the tools, we start to get a different story. So the first difference I noticed is in the estimated number of documents out in the world. And it's a big difference once you do the inversions. And so that's pretty sizable that, Google's estimating that there are almost, 50 million more for one version of the keyword and 50 million less for the other. And that's a very big difference in perspective as to what's out in the world. So right off the bat, it looks like Google sees the world differently for these two keywords. And then when I look at the ads, I see that the ad lineups can change based on the keywords. So it looks like the bidding strategies for these keywords are potentially different. I mean, they're very similar. You probably get a lot of people bidding on the same inversions, but the fact that you can actually bid differently on them is an important distinction. And then in the local block, you can actually get different local results for the inversions. So they're similar again, but they're not identical. It's not like Google is saying, these are the same search, give them the same output. They're similar, but different. And then when we look at the ranking results, we start to see that the rankings are different. And this is one area where I think the problem space occurs a lot, where people say, but it's a subtle difference. It's a minute difference. It's just, swapping number 6 and number 7, and, number 10 went up to number 8, or, something like that. So is this a little difference? But the problem is we're just like looking at our own focal point on this issue. So if we're just looking at our website and we are kind of near the top and that's all that matters to us, we're not seeing the big picture. We're just focused in on our little piece of the pie. When we step back and look at the whole thing, it tells a very different story. So what we're seeing here are the top 50 results for Seattle Lawyer and Lawyer Seattle. And we see that, we get a little bit of swapping in the top 15 or so. And it looks like, they're largely the same. But then very quickly, you get into things are different mode. And so the red ones over here, These are ones that didn't appear in the top 50 for the inversion. And the opposite is true. The red ones over here didn't appear in the top 50 for the other inversion. So if you're one of these red sites, you have no choice but to say these are two different keywords. And these arrows, I heat mapped them based on how steep the ranking change was. And so you see it's, yellow up here, then it gets more orange. And then, this pattern we see, we often refer to as the volatile middle. And so we see this in many different ways in many different circumstances, but there seems to always be this pattern in Google of stuff gets crazy around here. And so we see lots of differences once we get out of that top performing content. Now, academically, this blue one is the most interesting one of all. Because if Google was canonicalizing the two inversions, this should not be possible. This is a website that effectively ranked two different URLs for each inversion. So one domain, two different pages. And if they were being canonicalized, that shouldn't happen. Google should pick the same winner. Any thoughts on this so far?
It's a cool graphic. It's not surprising, as we know that the middle part jumps all around. But
yeah. But I mean, there's a lot of change here. And if you're up here, if you're number 3 and you're like, well, in the inversion, it's number 4. So these are largely the same. I could see why people have that perspective. I could see why if this is where your life is, you don't see much difference. But if you're down here, there's no way you believe that these two keywords are the same in Google's eyes, because you just don't see it in the data.
I would argue, though, if you're down there, you're doing something wrong anyway.
Yeah, but we're just looking at the facts of, are these exactly the same to Google, or are these different keywords to Google?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we try to look at it through Google's eyes, I think they have similar outcomes because of the fact that the variations are the same, and top performing content tends to target both rather well. But when we get down to the technical specifics, Google's treating them as different keywords. Another thing we can look at is, are the related searches the same? Because if Google's saying they're the same, then they should have the same related searches. And in this case, they had all the same ones, just in a different order.
I can tell you why.
Why is that?
Because we're seeing that related searches are dependent upon the search results themselves. Like the related searches, like what they're pulling from are pulled from the domains. So if the domains are in a slightly different order, these are going to slightly different order.
Interesting. So that's pretty cool, because on other keywords, I also noticed that they're not always the same, and that could explain that too.
It came up in my last presentation on. I put a fake keyword on one of my blogs in order to get that on Page Optimizer Pro in our blog section, just to get it quickly indexed. And when you search for that fake keyword, related searches came up, and the related searches were like Kyle Roof Lorem Ipsum. For a completely fake keyword, it was generating related searches, and that means that the related searches were based upon that URL that contained the fake keyword on it.
That's a very cool piece of information. Another thing we could look at between these are the primary index allocation. How many search results will Google give each inversion? And we can see that the allocations are different. So that's showing us that Google is giving different amounts of resources to these as different keywords. And it makes sense that the inversion that gets slightly more traffic gets slightly more allocation. So this kind of adds up to me. But it's interesting to see that, you know, the resource allocation to each of these keywords is different. And so then finally, I wanted to look at some other examples. And so I picked up a couple more examples, and then I went and looked at a bunch more that I didn't make slides for. And the same patterns kept repeating over and over again. So we see the same type of variation in the top 15, the same type of chaos below the top 15. We see different estimated documents out in the world, significantly different estimated documents out in the world. Sometimes the allocations are similar, but I believe that's probably largely based on the search volume of these. And if the search volume is similar, then the allocations are similar. That's my theory, at least. I'm still working on proving that. And then in these cases, the red related searches don't appear in the inversion. So we can see what's different in those inversions. But again, you know, if you're Wheezy's plumbing, you can't help but think they're two different keywords because you fell out of the top 15 for the other one, you know. And the same is true for this the Fox PH West Seattle plumbing. They fell out of the other one, so they can't help but think these are different. But if you're up here 1 and 2, you're probably thinking, oh, these two are the same. You know, it's a perception thing, but Google's actually treating these as different allocations. So another one, Seattle dog walker, same type of thing, very different estimations on the number of pages out in the world, same volatility in rankings. Allocations close but different. And in this case, yeah, the related searches look the same. And I did go and look at a bunch of other keywords, and they were all generally the same patterns. So I couldn't get any like real world keywords to show, you know, reasonably close results, you know, anything that was approaching, you know, identical, but with a tiny difference. They all had the same amount of chaos, the same amount of different estimations, different allocations. And so I can't help but think that in Google's eyes, these are different keywords. What are your thoughts?
I definitely would go with strut the putt over sniff Seattle. You could also say though that because the one thing that we haven't looked at are the meta titles, the title that shows in the SERP results. I would wager that one will win more than the other. And I would bet it's the Seattle dog walker would be my guess. So something you could say is that is actually, they do canonicalize, but they throw in some randomization on the one that they want to, that is the close variant.
Yeah, that makes some sense. And in some cases, like you won't really find the inversion as a variant. Let me go back. So here we have Seattle lawyer, and we see Seattle lawyer, but because nobody used lawyer Seattle in the meta description, you don't see it as a variation. Mm-hmm. Now, if people used it, it would obviously get bolded and be in the list, but since people don't have that behavior,
right?
You know, there's probably, you know, the grammar, the rules of grammar, the way people naturally communicate is probably putting more search volume onto one inversion over the other. And that probably means that at the end of the day, what's the best practice? Well, it's probably a very subtle choice. It's probably a subtle choice between a little bit more search volume versus a little easier to rank for because less competition.
I would be surprised that if you optimize for lawyer Seattle, that you could beat somebody, all things being equal, that's going for Seattle lawyer. In that situation, in these situations, what I do is I'll look at it and see that the results are relatively the same. And then I'll go and look and see which one has more in their meta titles. And in the Seattle lawyer, it's Seattle lawyers. So that's then the one that I would use as my primary and optimize that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. I'm just constantly thinking about how can we test this? How can we create tests for it? You have any thoughts on how we could test this?
What aspect do you want to test?
Just inversions in general. So the question being, how could we replicate this under scientific conditions? Yeah, and there may not be an easy answer.
We could go for 2-word phrases and see what happens.
Yeah, try the inversions and try to set up different scenarios that we see occurring in nature. But I'm definitely intrigued. I think this is an area that probably hasn't gotten a lot of reasonable testing. But I can see why people who rank well for a keyword think Google's treating them the same, and people who are a little bit further down, not a lot further down, talking difference between being number 6 and being number 15, would have a very different experience on it. Any thoughts from you, Clint? How do you deal with keyword inversions?
I was just trying to think, because I do it with anchor text, so I'll optimize for one, so Seattle dog walker, and then I'll use anchor text and maybe H2 tags to hit that other variation, the inverse, or even H4s. So that's how I handle it. I never really, I was looking at like which one gets more traffic, which one is the actual, like a normal searcher versus an SEO, like a Seattle dog walker or dog walker Seattle. Who's gonna, how are they gonna search better for that and stuff? So, I was just sitting here like kind of brainstorming in my own head how would we test the differences, and how do we measure? Is it on purpose or is it SEOs that are causing this warble? You know what I mean? The optimization of the pages.
And does Google actually check to see if the inversion changes the intent of the search?
Yeah.
And are there cases where they don't think it does, so they canonicalize the two to be the same search?
Right.
And I was unable to find evidence of Google canonicalizing the inversion to be the same search. And I know that Lee has research in this area, and we should probably get Lee to share that research on the show sometime. So Lee, if you're watching, I think we should probably revisit this in a few weeks and share some more data. So that's all I have on this topic. So I guess we could go to general banter and some Q&A.
Or early lunch.
Or no, we could never do early lunch.
Not for you, because you're in a different time zone. Clint and I are dying over here.
I already ate lunch. Let's see. Looking through the questions. Leon wanted to know how you're handling when you're pulling your rankings, how you handle the people also ask and other nuances and SERPs that take up a position.
Well, you have to keep in mind that Google is a meta search engine. And meta search engines are basically search engines that take the output from multiple search engines and blend them all together in some way. So Google is blending in image search, news search, video search, shopping, ad search, knowledge graph. People also ask, related searches, and so on. There's probably about 2-3 dozen different search engines that each have their own algorithms. And all of that gets blended together into what you see as the search results. And so we consider that type of behavior, that meta blending, is its own kind of algorithm. It's the meta mix of the search results. And Google can impact organic by giving more real estate or more above the fold real estate to ads or to knowledge graph or to other competing search products to organic web search. And so how do we, let's see, let me revisit that. How are you handling the people also ask? Well, largely people aren't handling it. But what's interesting is when you really look closely at those, when you go and view source at the people also ask and some of the other meta search sources, Google is actually bolding the variants for those search algorithms too. And when you view source, you can see that they have different variations in the answers for the questions. And so if you target for those variations and those questions, you have a better chance of being in those lists as well. And one type of strategy you can have for SEO is not just to get the best ranking on page one, but to take up more positions on page one. Try to take up, 5 of the links on page one. Try to take 10. And getting your questions into the people also ask gives you more of the page one real estate. You guys have any thoughts on the other aspects, the other content in search?
I always think that it's a big clue as to what Google wants answered. Like, I think it's telling, I would love this answer. Please provide. And it's a good thing to focus in on to get on your sites.
Now, Clint, I know you're a big fan of the question content. Is there a way you like to use it?
It's I'm kind of doing some different stuff though. I'm using it from a content marketing perspective, maybe even silos. So I'm not like directly actively going after those terms for the purposes of conversion. So and then when you look at the stuff in the SERPs, like people also asking, I'm thinking about like knowing Leon and what he's doing, and I'm thinking he's looking at it from a technical perspective. For a tool he may or may not be creating. And I think you might have handled that in Quora, because typically I don't see a lot of people also ask come up in the search results when I'm using Quora. So I think you might have handled that with the NCR that eliminated that. I'm not sure if that's true. I could be full of shit. Which might be more along the lines of how he's asking it, and are you counting that stuff inside of Quora as a position, or have you figured out a way to eliminate it? And from everything I've seen, it's kind of the NCR search is eliminated.
Well, the Quora will only look at the organic web part of the meta mix, so it's not going to look at those other search result sources. So Quora is kind of blind to news search and people also ask and local and ad search. So those are different search engines with different algorithms.
Right.
Cora's very much focused on only the organic web part.
Yeah, and I think that's probably over along the lines of his question. That's now, if you're asking me about, do I in a real world thing, if I see people also ask versus don't, I haven't really seen many instances where the inversion, the flip, which is what we're talking about, has one has questions versus the other doesn't. I haven't seen a lot of that. So, especially in local. So if it's there in one, it's typically there in the other. And usually, kind of like Kyle does, I do the same thing. Is I use those people also ask, and that's either new headings inside my original content, or those are topics from my silo pages.
So we got a question. What about creating 2 pages on a website that targets both keywords? Would this work or cause cannibalization? That's a good question. We saw one website pull it off. We didn't see a lot of websites pulling it off. So, I'm not entirely sure how that one website managed to pull it off, but the fact that they could, that it was even possible, is telling of the architecture and strategy that Google's using. The fact that that's even a possibility means that Google is storing them differently as separate keywords. But is that a best practice? That I'm not as sure about. I think those websites at the top that were ranking for both we're doing it typically from the same URL. So there's probably an efficiency there that makes trying to get one page to get both to be, the best way to do it. Otherwise, we'd see, the opposite. We'd see lots of businesses having 2 pages for each. And so that's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect one page for both probably has some advantage somewhere.
And Ted, I'd be hesitant on that local result because you see it a lot in local where you have a page that you have optimized for a particular term and Google doesn't care and they just rank the homepage. And the more that you optimize that internal page, the more work you do to it, the higher the homepage goes. You see that a lot in local. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock into that they intentionally did 2 separate pages. I would imagine that for a lot of their terms, their homepage ranks, regardless of what they're doing on any other page.
Exactly. So what that business is doing, that's not really what I was looking at when I highlighted it. I was highlighting that the fact that Google could allow different URLs to rank for the inversion. That is the interesting part that was telling about Google's behavior. Let's see. Any more questions?
I think that might be it. Just want to mention also the AMA I've got going tonight for those that are in IMG. Join me. If you have more questions on this, it's an AMA. You can ask.
Yeah, and I guess we're getting into a new season of conferences. You guys have any conferences coming in the near future?
I think the first for all of us is spring. Oh, no. I'm going to Slovenia in orbit. Great conference if you need to go to the Balkans. But then after that is in orbit, right? Or SEO spring training.
Yep. I'll be at SEO spring training. You going to that one, Clint?
Yep, I'm speaking there as well.
So yeah, we'll probably talk about SEO spring training more in the coming weeks.
Terry has agreed to come on next week to talk about it.
Then we're talking about it next week.
Oh, perfect.
Awesome. So if you're looking for a conference to go to in the near future here, it looks like SEO spring training might be an opportunity for you. So be sure to check out next week when we talk about what's happening at this event. So any final thoughts, guys?
Nope.
No, good stuff. We'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks a lot. Hope we gave you a lot to think about. I'm not sure that we came up with any definitive outcome other than we probably need to look at this more closely. But that's an interesting conversation that started in IMG. So if you want your ideas and your topic threads to spin off into whole episodes, check out IMG. Come join the conversation. All right. Thanks a lot.
See you, everybody.
Yeah.